introduce our next speaker, Peter Cormack. We're very fortunate that Peter is our honorary curator at Kelmscott, and he was formerly director of the former keeper of the William Morris Gallery at Walthamstow.
Thank you, Jo. What did Kelmscott mean to William Morris? How did it influence his art and thought? And how do we communicate that to our visitors? Well, as next one. Oops. As we've heard, it was a lot more than just a delightful home in the country for Morris and his family. They, of course, leased it during Morris's lifetime, but it was actually bought by his widow, Jane Morris, just a year before she died. In 1913, it was bought by her. For Morris, it was a heaven on earth, a harbour of refuge, but also a place of continual inspiration. And I think it's important that his discovery of Kelmscott came at a particularly formative phase of his career. He'd been living over the shop in Queen Square in Bloomsbury for 5 years after leaving Red House. And this was really the period, the early 1870s, when he begins the career we now remember him best for as a pattern designer in particular. And the inspiration for all Morris's patterns is, of course, nature. It's precious little nature in Bloomsbury at that time, or now perhaps. And so Kelmscott provided the perfect place for the inspiration of, I think, just about all his patterns, one could say. The house was loved by the family from the start. You see a watercolour by May Morris in the top left, showing her mother and herself and her sister in the tapestry room with the 17th century tapestries that adorn the walls. Morris, in his own description, talks about this room as a very pleasant background for the living people who haunt the room. It's interesting he uses the word haunt. There's something about Kelmscott that you could almost say was a state of mind for Morris. When he wasn't there, it was still very much present in his imagination. And that, I think, is something that we are very conscious of in our plans for the future of the house. The white parlour on the right, those very comfortable chairs upholstered in Morris fabric. One of the important things about Kelmscott is, I think, that it brought home to Morris that after his decade or so of being a Pre-Raphaelite and a medievalist, that Ruskin's true nature of Gothic was something far broader than just a stylistic phase, that actually this house, built in the 17th century, was also Gothic, and that actually Gothic, as Ruskin meant it, was all about vernacular craftsmanship, far more than simply a particular historical set of styles. The house, of course, as we have it now, contains many artifacts that were not there in Morris's time, including things brought from Red House, the embroidery on the left of Penelope, designed by Morris and worked by his sister-in-law, Bessie Burden. But it also has furniture that had been brought into the house by the Turner family, the owners before Morris took the lease, including this wonderful bed, which was decorated with embroideries by May Morris, his daughter. But as I mentioned before, it's nature, I think, that was, of course, a lifelong inspiration for Morris, and it was nature that was so abundant at Kelmscott throughout the seasons. And Morris's letters are so full of references to the garden, the birds in particular. It's tempting to quote very extensively from these, but I suppose we've got on the right the Strawberry Thief, one of his most famous patterns, which I'm sure is a reminiscence directly of an incident he describes in one of his letters. As to the garden, it seems to me its chief fruit is blackbirds. However, they have left us some gooseberries, and I shall set to work this morning and get some more before their next sit-down meal. Well, blackbirds didn't quite work in the pattern, so he's changed them into song thrushes and missel thrushes to great effect. But almost every letter he wrote from Kelmscott, certainly to his family, has some reference to the birds and the flowers in great detail, not scientific detail, but wonderful poetic lyrical detail. And I think one of our hopes is that we can make much more of the environment generally at Kelmscott and see it through Morris's eyes. And that inspiration was absolutely constant, not just in the patterns for wallpapers and fabrics, which we know very well, but you can see it cross-fertilizes his work in stained glass. You see on the right this wonderful sort of willowy background for a figure in a church in Sussex, in one of the Morris and Company stained glass windows, a figure by Burne-Jones. And of course it's important to stress that Morris was a pioneer green, an environmentalist. He was just as passionate about caring for our natural environment as for the built environment. And that was a priority for him, and it's something I think that we will wish to highlight in what we do at Kelmscott in the future. Morris was an antiquary. Right throughout his career, he had this great respect for the past and a feeling that the past could be an inspiration. A very early example on the left is one of his brass rubbings that he did when a very young man, well, still a student at Oxford, brass rubbing on the right, and the figure directly derived from it, again in stained glass, figure of Lancelot on the left. And on the right-hand side, one of his glorious illuminated manuscripts. This is the Virgil's Aeneid, which he did in the 1870s, and later it was actually completed after his death. And one of the things I hope we will be able to do at Kelmscott in the future is to use our exhibition rooms for temporary exhibitions that relate to the preoccupations of the Society of Antiquaries. We have wonderful collections here at Burlington House, and it will be appropriate, I think, to have some of these exhibitions, some of these collections on show to the public at Kelmscott. Morris would have approved as an antiquarian himself, and it enables the Society to have a sort of public window that our meetings here at Burlington House don't perhaps offer us. Morris's passionate love of historic buildings is rooted, I think, in Kelmscott, in the experience of a house that for him embodied, almost literally, the experience and the lives of the people who had created it. And he, from the late 1870s onwards, he expands that into his creation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which becomes this great campaigning movement to protect the built environment and to protest against, the example on the left is what was done at St Albans Cathedral, the complete obliteration of the West Front and its replacement by what was called restoration. There's clearly no restoration at all. And Morris writes most passionately and eloquently about the sort of work that could be seen in our village churches all over the country. The sort of work I illustrate there, just from Radstone in Northamptonshire, a beautiful piece of 14th century carving. Exquisite work which was done not for big buildings, but for almost forgotten buildings in the countryside, and yet he felt that these, as I say, embodied the experience of those who had put them together. And finally, I think there is a dimension that is hugely important for us, and which will be a great challenge, but I think one that we will rise to, which is to convey something of the, Sandy talked about it, Kelmscott of the imagination. Kelmscott Manor became a character in that great novel, News from Nowhere, Morris talks about it as if it were a person. He also wrote in one of his letters that it was like visiting something that is not quite real. Well, it was very real for him, and he was the tenant there. And yet he had a view of it that somehow, as I say, it was a state of mind, that it stayed with him when he wasn't there as well. So when he revisited, it was almost like waking up from a dream and finding himself there. And of course, that's the basic premise of his great novel, News from Nowhere. So we have the challenge to see Kelmscott through Morris's own eyes. We've got to move away from the place as a reverential museum come shrine, which is, I think, largely how it's been seen, to the great satisfaction of our visitors, I must say. But we have the potential to go beyond that, I think, in the future, to explore all the historical strata, which we haven't done in the past, going way back to the 17th century and before, indeed, of the buildings and the whole site, and to explore the creative and imaginative dimensions of the house and its surroundings, which are really a process for us of evoking as much as interpreting. Evocation, which is going to be a challenging task, I think, but an interesting one, so that we can respond to the intangible as well as to the material artifacts and existence of the house. Thank you.